Hello, future managers. Welcome to Week 2, Foundations or History of Management. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm a big history buff. I completely dork out over some of these management theorists in history. So we're going to try to go through them. There are three main eras that we're going to go through today. So there is the classical management era, and there's three main theorists that we're going to go over. So what I want you guys to do is I want you to make 3 columns in your notes, because I know you're all taking fantastic notes right now. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Okay, so if we have classical management here, and I'm really hoping you guys can see that a little bit. All right, I want you to think about classical management as kind of the beginning of management. So in the beginning, if you think about some of the other disciplines that are out there, maybe math or science have been around for thousands of years, right? They are not new concepts, but management, as we know it, has really only been around a little over 100 years. Before the Industrial Revolution, basically, if you were running a company, you were the owner, you owned the company, but the concept of management really started with the Industrial Revolution. So in the Industrial Revolution, we were making a lot of material and trying to get it out to as many people as possible, and we're making more. You know, this whole mass production thing became more larger. It's a new phenomenon, right? It never happened before. So that's when this whole concept of management came into play. So we're going to learn about 3 main theorists today, and I want you guys to make sure you put that in your left-hand column. The first one we're going to learn about is Frederick Taylor. He's what we call the father of scientific management, or the father of classical management. So make sure you put Taylor there and put some notes under Taylor. Frederick Taylor. Okay, leave some spaces, and then we'll move on to talking about Henry Fayol and then Max Weber. All right, so let's start off by talking about Frederick Taylor. Okay, so Frederick Taylor is known as the father of scientific management. So keep in mind, the Industrial Revolution is raging. We're mass producing things on a scale larger than ever before. So let me tell you a little bit about Frederick Taylor history. He was very wealthy, and as opposed to going off and living like a rich aristocrat, he actually decided to go work in the Bethlehem, Pennsylvania coal mines, okay? And he actually worked up through the levels. So he started off at the engineer level, and he really was working with the workers that were shoveling coal and putting it in the coal mines, and coal was being used to run railroads then. It was being used to heat houses. It's just being used exponentially. And so having somebody that had worked at the ground level, he then began to rise in the organization of the Bethlehem Coal Company, and he started to see some issues in the organization. And so he thought that he could make things more efficient. So basically, what was going on in Bethlehem coal mines is workers would basically, they were afraid of working too fast for fear that they would work themselves out of a job. So they would take their time. And so Taylor came up with this term called soldiering. Soldiering basically means that you're sitting around on the job. I mean, that term is still used a little bit more today. So what he began doing was saying, hey, listen, we're trying to get as much done as possible, and so he started saying there's got to be more efficient ways that we can, shovel the coal, fill these coal buckets, and get it up out of the mine faster and do away with the soldiering. So he started timing tasks. And so Frederick Taylor is known as making a science with a task. So take something as simple as shoveling coal, for example. All right, he basically said, okay, there has to be a specific motion to be the most efficient way to shovel the coal in there. There should be a certain weight that should be on a shovel. That's the optimal size. And then he also believed that you should be hiring only a certain type of people that are built for shoveling coal. So you wouldn't necessarily hire, a 90-pound kid to shovel coal all day, but you want to hire a big burly guy. So he was very much about hiring for the right abilities to do the job. And back then it was mostly very physical labor, okay? And so he believed you should only be trained to do one job, and you should get that job down to a science. So he was timing them, figuring out how long it would take to, shovel up a coal bucket and get it up out of the mine. He was timing all the different steps in between. And he believed that the only thing that really motivated workers were money. So he was all about show me the money. So he thought that was the only thing that there really was to feel motivated by giving them money. So he would basically say, we're going to pay you really well if you can do this job as efficiently as possible. So he was timing them, and people were working frantically to try to beat the clock, if you will. All right? So Frederick became very, very popular for this theory. In fact, he went on to design the shovel that you guys will see here. And so he decided the optimal weight of a shovel, and to be perfectly balanced, was 21 pounds. So the Frederick Taylor shovel became very popular, sold out everywhere, and any job anywhere that needed a shovel had a Frederick Taylor shovel, because it was supposed to be, you know, the most scientific, most efficient shovel possible. And keep in mind, 21 pounds, exactly what you need for a shovel weight to be most efficient according to Taylor, according to his science. All right, but what do you guys see are some of the problems that could come up from that? All right, basically what it became down to is it's taking all of what is to be a person and it's breaking it down to a series of movements. All right, so if Taylor was working on the shovel, there's another couple called the Gilbreths, Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, who were working on bricklaying, for example, and they figured out all the perfect ways to lay bricks and how to be the most efficient in movements. And again, you're breaking down all of it as a person to a series of movements. And so if you think about it, it really made human beings become more like robots or like machines. It was all about how can we just get the biggest output possible. It wasn't leaving room for emotions or anything along those lines. So this kind of caught the attention of somebody else in the early 1900s after Frederick Taylor's The Science of Management came out, I think in 1911. What was else being coming out around that time? 1911. It was Ford, and their very first model, it was before the Model A, but it became the Model T. The invention of the assembly line was inspired by Frederick Taylor, and we still see the assembly line today. If you guys go to Chipotle ever, Chipotle still has that assembly line. You can go down the line and choose all your toppings. That's all inspired by Frederick Taylor. Okay, so long story short, Frederick Taylor went into Ford's factory and helped him optimize and create this assembly line. And so if I move myself over down here, you guys can see a little graphic, but it's basically just taking people down to like a series of motions like a robot, all right? And it really wasn't showing the human side at all, and people were working themselves to exhaustion. Keep in mind back then, guys, there was no weekend. They didn't know what a weekend was. They were working usually 7 days a week. They didn't have vacation days. They didn't have sick days. There was no 8-hour workday. None of those worker rights or protections were put into place yet. So people were working 16-hour days. They weren't able to stop for bathroom breaks. People would lose a limb on the job, and they'd have no sort of protection for them. And so it was a really, really tough time for workers, being basically reduced down to a series of motion like a robot. All right, so that's what's going on here in the U.S. in the beginning of classical management. Let's go across the pond and take a look at what was going on in Europe. Okay, so this is Henry Fayol. Henry Fayol was French, so I want you guys to make sure whatever you wrote about Taylor, we're going to move on to Fayol now. Henri Fayol. So Henry Fayol is a little bit different. So he also is very much about studying the art of management, but he wasn't so much from the worker working his way up to the organization the way that Taylor did in the coal mine. What he did was he went and observed managers or owners of businesses at all different organizations, over 100 organizations all throughout France. And he put together some observations of what he thought a manager was according to his studies of these managers that are in France. And basically what he came down to was managers are an advocate of education and experience. So they both have an education component to management, which you guys are working on right now, and there's also an experience side to management. So he was the first person to really coin that. And this might sound a little familiar to you guys. Do you guys remember we were talking about Polk last week? Well, he was actually the creator of what we have as the functional definition of management. Our management course is actually designed around this definition that Henry Fayol came up with over 100 years ago. All right, so he worded it a little differently. We've combined it a little bit, but foresight was what he had said. That's now planning. Organization is still organization. We put command and coordination into one word, which is leading. And then last is control. So his five-pronged definition of the function of management, how management actually looks like, is still 100 years later the best definition we come up with for management. So Henry Fayol was very much a visionary. And again, this is from observing managers all over Paris in the early 1900s. So he's one of the second fathers of classical management. To keep moving right along here, the third is Max Weber. Max Weber, or Weber you can say, was German. And he is the father of bureaucratic management. So make sure you make some notes under Max Weber. Okay, so these three guys are the founders of classical management. And so what's really interesting about Max Weber was he was noticing in Germany, right next to Henry Fayol, and again, these guys had no idea. The internet didn't exist then. They couldn't call up the phone and talk. They couldn't send an email. They had no idea what the other ones were doing, but they were both all doing the same studies of management, okay? So Max Weber basically was seeing in Germany that there was a lot of people, they were seeing a lot of class differences. There was a lot of people that were at this bottom layer of the organization who had a ton of experience, knew all how an organization would run, and then there would basically be, you know, the elite class running the business, and they didn't have a clue how the business was run. They didn't have an experience, they didn't have an education. It was all because of what social class they were part of or who they were related to that put them into this position of power in the organization. So what Weber said was, this is not how it should be. You know, when it comes to a larger business, it needs to be rational. So he was saying that he came up with what we call, I'll get to that in a minute, but basically he came up with saying that the roles in an organization should be based upon legitimate authority. It should all be based upon your qualifications. So if you're going to move up the ladder, you need to have the qualifications. You can't just slide right into running the business because you're the owner's son, all right? So he basically came up with this whole tree. The whole like the lower level of management, the middle level of management, and the top management. That whole traditional pyramid that we talked about last week was made up by Max Weber. All right, so he was basically saying that there needs to be some sort of career progression. So if you start off at the bottom of the ladder, you need to know that as you get more qualifications, you're gonna be able to move up the ranks. People gotta have that kind of hope and that career progression. And the people that are running the organization should have the most technical qualifications. They should know the best how to run an organization. And so that's what he was like, it should all be based on rules. It shouldn't be personal. And be like, oh yeah, I like you, so I'm gonna have you rising up the ladder. He believed that it should be very impersonal, and your qualifications should be what helped you rise in the organization. And so that would help make businesses run the best and be more orderly and also be more productive. He believed that businesses should be efficient and fair. And so that was one of the really big things that, that Weber was a part of. See, we've got to put rules in place. We have to make sure that everybody has their functional specialty based upon what they know, and that they're going to be able to move up the hierarchical structure or up the pyramid based upon what they know. All right, so that's classical management in a nutshell, guys. Those are the three main theorists that you need to know. All right, but here's what I want you guys to take away. Foundations of classical management. Focus on efficiency. All right, the impersonalization of workers. So basically treating them as machines or robots. And that classical management is really where we come up with the basis for assembly lines. So that's classical management. Go ahead and check out the next video. We'll talk about behavioral management.